The funny thing about bullies is they almost always believe nobody is paying attention. My name is Daniel Carter, and if you had driven through my neighborhood on a quiet Tuesday morning 6 months ago, you probably would have laughed at what looked like the world's unluckiest trash can. Every single Tuesday, just before sunrise, I would open my front door with a fresh cup of coffee in my hand, step onto the porch of the house I had spent 15 years paying for, and find my dark green trash can lying flat in the middle of the street while every other can on the block stood perfectly upright. At first, I blamed the wind. Colorado weather has a personality of its own, and strong overnight gusts aren't exactly unusual. Then I blamed raccoons, even though I had never actually seen one anywhere near our subdivision. After the third week, I started paying closer attention. My neighbor's trash can stayed exactly where they had placed them. Mine somehow traveled almost 20 feet into the roadway every single collection day. It didn't matter whether I positioned it against the curb, beside the mailbox, or closer to my driveway. Somehow it always ended up on its side before the garbage truck arrived. My neighbors started making jokes about it. The driver from the sanitation company even smiled one morning and asked if I needed a heavier trash can. I laughed with him because it seemed easier than explaining that something about the whole situation felt wrong. I have worked as a mechanical engineer for nearly 2 decades, and one habit my profession teaches better than anything else is that repeated patterns are rarely accidents. Machines leave patterns. Structures leave patterns. People leave patterns too. The more I looked at my trash can, the less random everything appeared. The scratches on one side always matched. The lid always landed facing the same direction. Even the wheel marks in the grass seemed almost identical from week to week. Somebody wasn't simply knocking it over. Somebody was doing exactly the same thing over and over again. My neighborhood happened to be governed by one of those homeowners associations that seemed convinced every mailbox, flower bed, and blade of grass represented civilization itself. The loudest voice on the board belonged to Linda Harper. She never officially introduced herself as the neighborhood authority, but everyone acted as though she had. She drove through the subdivision almost every morning in the same dark SUV, slowing down just enough to inspect driveways, fences, and lawns with the expression of someone searching for tiny imperfections. I'd received 2 warning letters from the HOA before this started, both for things so minor I barely remembered them. One claimed my recycling bin had been visible from the sidewalk for an extra afternoon after pickup. The other suggested my lawn edging wasn't perfectly straight. I corrected both issues without complaint because I preferred peaceful neighbors over pointless arguments. Still, something changed after the second letter. Linda began appearing near my street with surprising frequency. Sometimes I noticed her vehicle rolling slowly past my house while I worked in the garage. Sometimes she'd stop just long enough to glance toward the curb before continuing around the block. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it meant everything. What I did know was that every Tuesday morning my trash can greeted me from the asphalt like it had been trying to escape during the night. And no matter how ridiculous the whole thing looked, my instincts kept telling me this story wasn't about garbage at all. What I didn't know yet was that the same ordinary trash can everyone laughed about would soon become the reason our entire HOA board called an emergency meeting they would never forget. By the 4th Tuesday, curiosity had completely replaced frustration. I stopped treating the situation like an inconvenience and started treating it like an engineering problem. Instead of asking who might be responsible, I asked a different question. What sequence of events would have to happen for the same result to appear every single week? That question changed everything. I woke up before 5 o'clock every Tuesday morning for the next 3 weeks. I left every light inside the house turned off, brewed my coffee without switching on the kitchen lights, and watched the street through a narrow opening in my living room curtains. The subdivision was almost perfectly quiet before dawn. Sprinkler systems clicked on 1 yard at a time. A newspaper delivery car rolled slowly through the neighborhood. Rabbits wandered across freshly cut lawns without any concern. Everything followed a predictable rhythm. Then another pattern began to reveal itself. At almost exactly 5:45 every Tuesday morning, Linda Harper's dark sport utility vehicle entered my street. She never stopped in front of my house. She simply drove more slowly there than anywhere else before continuing around the corner. The timing was remarkably consistent. Less than 10 minutes later, I would discover my trash can lying on its side. I still did not have proof of anything. A slow-moving vehicle was not evidence. It was simply another piece of a puzzle that refused to fit together by coincidence alone. My engineering background had taught me something equally important over the years. When observations begin repeating, you document them before drawing conclusions. So I bought a small notebook and began recording everything. Weather conditions, wind speed reported by the local forecast, trash collection times, vehicle traffic, even the direction my trash can landed after each incident. By the end of the month, several pages were filled with notes, sketches, and timestamps. The most interesting discovery had nothing to do with the trash can itself. It was the weather. 3 of those Tuesdays had almost no measurable wind before sunrise, yet the position of the trash can remained almost identical every time. Nature rarely produces perfect consistency. People often do. I quietly mentioned the situation to my next-door neighbor while we collected our empty bins one afternoon. He looked around before lowering his voice. Then he admitted something I had not expected. He had seen Linda walking near my driveway early one Tuesday, several weeks earlier. At the time, he assumed she was inspecting the neighborhood for HOA violations because she often did that. He never imagined it might have anything to do with my trash can. He apologized for never mentioning it sooner because, in his words, it had seemed too insignificant to matter. To me, it mattered a great deal. Even then, I refused to accuse anyone. Assumptions create arguments. Evidence creates answers. That distinction became my entire strategy. I spent the following weekend reading every page of our HOA regulations, city sanitation guidelines, and municipal ordinances concerning residential trash containers. Most homeowners would probably consider that a miserable way to spend a Saturday afternoon, but buried inside those documents were surprisingly specific rules about placement, access, maintenance, and homeowner responsibilities. The more I read, the more I realized something important. If I wanted this problem to end permanently, I could not simply prove someone had been bothering my trash can. I needed a solution so carefully designed that once the truth finally surfaced, nobody could question the facts, the process, or the outcome. The following Monday afternoon, I left work a little earlier than usual and drove past 3 hardware stores before finding exactly what I had been looking for. Most people saw a trash can as nothing more than a plastic container with wheels. I saw it as a simple object that could become part of a perfectly documented system. I was not interested in embarrassing anyone. I was interested in removing every possible excuse. If someone claimed the wind had tipped it over, I wanted weather data. If someone claimed an animal had knocked it down, I wanted physical evidence. If someone insisted nothing unusual had happened, I wanted an accurate timeline that spoke for itself. By the time I returned home, my garage looked more like a small engineering workshop than a place to park a truck. I installed a reinforced base beneath the new trash can that remained completely hidden from casual view, but kept the container standing naturally under normal conditions. Next, I mounted a compact vibration sensor inside the body of the container where it could record movement without being visible from outside. Then I added a small weather-resistant camera positioned legally on my own property, with its viewing angle limited entirely to my driveway and curb area. I carefully checked city regulations twice before installing it, because I wanted every piece of equipment to comply with local privacy laws and HOA rules. Finally, I synchronized every device using the official atomic clock so that each timestamp would match down to the exact second. It probably seemed excessive for protecting a trash can, but I had learned something during years of solving engineering failures. Small details often determine whether the truth survives scrutiny. During the following days, I tested everything repeatedly. I rolled the container into position exactly where the sanitation department recommended. I gently pushed it to simulate normal movement. I measured how much force was required before the vibration sensor activated. I reviewed the camera footage from different lighting conditions before sunrise and after sunset. Every adjustment made the system more reliable without making it noticeable. From the sidewalk, nothing appeared different. It was still an ordinary dark green trash can sitting beside an ordinary suburban curb. That was exactly what I wanted. On Thursday evening, Linda drove through the neighborhood while I was trimming a hedge near the front porch. She slowed briefly, glanced toward the curb, and continued without saying a word. I nodded politely as though nothing in the world had changed. In truth, everything had changed. For the first time since this strange routine had started, I was no longer waiting for something to happen. I was ready for whatever happened. Friday passed quietly. Saturday morning brought neighborhood joggers, children riding bicycles, and families washing their cars. Sunday afternoon, I grilled burgers with my brother, who laughed when I explained how much planning had gone into what looked like the most ordinary trash can in Colorado. Even he admitted it sounded ridiculous until I showed him the notebook filled with observations and timestamps. His smile disappeared as he turned the pages. By Monday night, the system was fully charged. Every sensor had been tested one final time, and the camera memory card was empty and waiting. I wheeled the trash can to the curb with the same calm routine I had followed every week before heading back inside. From the outside, nothing looked unusual. That was the beauty of the entire plan. Anyone passing my house would have seen nothing more than another homeowner preparing for trash collection. They would never have guessed that every second from that moment until sunrise was about to be recorded with the kind of precision that left almost no room for coincidence, misunderstanding, or denial. Tuesday arrived with the same quiet stillness that had greeted me for weeks. But this time I was not standing behind my curtains wondering whether my instincts were wrong. I was waiting for data. At exactly 5:15 in the morning, I poured myself a cup of coffee, turned off every light facing the street, and opened the monitoring application connected to the camera and vibration sensor. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. The trash can stood exactly where I had positioned it the previous evening. The air was calm according to both my backyard weather station and the National Weather Service report. Tree branches barely moved, and the American flag across the street hung almost motionless. At 5:44, headlights appeared at the end of the block. Right on schedule, Linda Harper's dark sport utility vehicle rolled slowly toward my house. She drove past without stopping, disappearing around the corner exactly as she had every previous Tuesday. I waited. 6 minutes passed. Nothing happened. Then, at 5:51, the vibration sensor suddenly activated. My computer displayed a precise timestamp while the camera quietly continued recording. I watched the live video with complete silence filling my living room. A person entered the edge of the frame from the sidewalk, walked directly toward the trash can, looked briefly in both directions, reached out with one hand, and deliberately tipped the container onto its side before calmly walking away. The reinforced base kept the movement controlled exactly as I had designed it, preventing unnecessary damage while allowing every action to be captured with exceptional clarity. Seconds later, the sensor automatically logged the force applied, the exact duration of movement, and the time the container came to rest. I replayed the footage twice before saying a single word. There was no dramatic celebration. There was only quiet confirmation. Weeks of observations, notes, weather records, and careful preparation had finally produced the one thing assumptions never could: objective evidence. I exported the original video without making a single edit, copied the sensor log into a secure folder, and backed up every file onto 2 separate storage devices. Then I printed the weather report, my observation notebook, and the timestamp records so every document matched perfectly. Around 7:30, the sanitation truck completed its route, and by 8 o'clock, I placed the trash can back beside my garage exactly as though nothing unusual had happened. Later that morning, I saw Linda speaking with another board member outside the clubhouse. She smiled politely when she noticed me driving past, and I returned the same courteous nod I always had. There was no confrontation because there did not need to be one. She still believed another ordinary Tuesday had come and gone without consequence. What she did not realize was that every important piece of the puzzle now fit together with remarkable precision. The repeated pattern, the weather conditions, the consistent timing, the documented observations, the sensor data, and the unedited recording all supported the same simple conclusion without exaggeration or emotion. My goal had never been to catch someone making a mistake. My goal had been to make certain that when the truth finally reached the HOA board, the conversation would no longer depend on opinions, personalities, or excuses. It would depend entirely on facts, and facts have a remarkable way of changing rooms that arguments never can. The next step required more patience than preparation. I already had everything I needed, but I understood that evidence has little value unless it is presented the right way. Instead of posting the video online or sharing it with neighbors, I organized every document into a clear timeline that anyone could follow without needing my opinion. I labeled each weather report, every observation from my notebook, each timestamp from the vibration sensor, and every frame of the unedited recording. I even included copies of the relevant HOA regulations and the city sanitation guidelines that I had studied the previous weekend. By the time I finished, the entire package looked less like a complaint and more like an engineering report. On Wednesday morning, I emailed the complete file to the HOA board, the association management company, and the attorney listed as legal counsel for the community. My message was short, professional, and free of accusations. I simply explained that I had documented a recurring issue affecting my property, that I believed the attached material deserved careful review, and that I would appreciate discussing it during the next scheduled board meeting. Within an hour, I received an automatic confirmation from the management company acknowledging receipt of the documents. The board remained silent. That afternoon, I noticed several board members arriving at the clubhouse earlier than usual. Through the large front windows, I could see papers spread across the conference table. Linda's vehicle was already parked outside. She looked confident as she walked inside, carrying her usual binder, apparently unaware of what had arrived in everyone's inbox only a few hours earlier. Late that evening, my telephone rang. It was the association manager, whose calm voice sounded noticeably more serious than during our previous conversations. He thanked me for organizing the information so thoroughly and asked whether the original video files and sensor records were available if the board requested verification. I told him they were stored in multiple locations exactly as they had been recorded, without edits or alterations. He paused for a moment before saying that the board had decided to add my matter to the agenda for Thursday night's meeting. That single sentence told me everything I needed to know. If the evidence had been weak, there would have been no reason for a formal discussion. Thursday evening, the clubhouse meeting room filled more quickly than usual. Homeowners occupied nearly every chair, many unaware of why attendance had suddenly increased. I sat quietly near the middle of the room with a single binder resting on my lap. Linda entered a few minutes later and smiled politely toward the audience before taking her usual seat at the front table. As routine business concluded, the association manager cleared his throat and announced that the next agenda item concerned documentation submitted by a homeowner regarding repeated interference with personal property. A projector illuminated the screen at the front of the room. First appeared the weather reports, then the observation logs. Next came the synchronized timestamps from the sensor system. Finally, the original video began playing exactly as it had been recorded. Nobody spoke while the recording unfolded. The room remained completely silent except for the soft sound of the projector fan. When the video ended, the manager displayed the matching timestamps beside the sensor data and my handwritten observations collected over several weeks. Every document aligned with remarkable precision. Nobody needed to interpret anything because the evidence explained itself. For the first time since this strange story had begun, the discussion was no longer about speculation. It had become a conversation entirely grounded in documented facts, and I could see from the expressions around the room that the balance of the meeting had already begun to shift. The chairman thanked everyone for remaining respectful before asking whether I wished to add anything beyond the material already displayed on the screen. I stood, placed my binder on the conference table, and answered with a single sentence. I said that I was not asking anyone to take my word for what had happened because the documentation could speak more accurately than I ever could. I then opened the binder to the section containing the applicable HOA bylaws, municipal sanitation regulations, and the Association Code of Conduct. One by one, I showed how every step I had taken complied with the rules governing homeowner surveillance on private property, trash container placement, and evidence preservation. There was no dramatic speech because there did not need to be one. Every question from the board received a document, a timestamp, or a regulation instead of an opinion. The association attorney quietly requested permission to examine the original video files and metadata. I handed over the storage drive without hesitation. A few minutes later, he confirmed that the timestamps matched the accompanying sensor logs and that there was no indication the recordings had been altered. The atmosphere inside the room changed almost immediately. Board members who had spent years discussing landscaping violations and mailbox colors now found themselves reviewing a completely different kind of issue, one involving documented interference with a homeowner's property. Linda remained unusually quiet throughout the discussion. When the chairman invited her to respond, She spoke carefully and acknowledged that her actions had been inappropriate and inconsistent with the standards expected from a board member. She expressed regret to both the board and the homeowners present. The chairman thanked her for addressing the matter directly before asking the remaining board members to discuss possible corrective measures. After nearly 30 minutes of conversation, several motions were introduced and approved. The board voted to issue a formal written apology, reimburse me for the cost of replacing the damaged trash container, and adopt a new evidence review policy requiring objective documentation before violation notices involving recurring complaints could be issued in the future. They also approved additional ethics guidance for board members to reinforce professional conduct while performing neighborhood inspections. The association manager later told me that the discussion had prompted a broader review of several internal procedures that had not been updated in years. As homeowners began leaving the clubhouse, many stopped to thank me, not because of the trash can itself, but because the process had remained calm, respectful, and focused entirely on facts. Even neighbors who had joked about my unfortunate Tuesday mornings admitted they had never imagined such a small problem would lead to meaningful improvements for the entire community. As I stepped outside, the evening air felt unusually peaceful. Linda approached me near the parking lot and offered another sincere apology. I accepted it without hesitation because my objective had never been humiliation or revenge. I had simply wanted the unnecessary pattern to end and for the rules to apply fairly to everyone, including those responsible for enforcing them. The following Tuesday morning, I opened my front door with my usual cup of coffee. My trash can stood exactly where I had left it the night before. So did every other trash can along the street. Nothing appeared unusual anymore, and that was precisely the outcome I had hoped for from the very beginning. Sometimes the strongest response is not the loudest one. Sometimes it is a careful record, a patient plan, and the quiet confidence that truth, when supported by undeniable facts, eventually finds its own voice. Life settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly ordinary after everything that had happened, but the effects of that single board meeting continued to ripple through the neighborhood in quiet and meaningful ways. About 2 weeks later, the HOA published its monthly community newsletter, and for the first time since I had moved into the subdivision, one entire section focused on transparency rather than violations. The board announced updated inspection procedures, new documentation standards, and a commitment to resolving homeowner concerns through objective evidence instead of assumptions. Reading those words over my morning coffee felt strangely satisfying because they represented something much larger than my own experience. They represented a community willing to learn from an uncomfortable moment instead of pretending it had never happened. During the following month, I noticed small changes everywhere. Inspection notices became more detailed and included photographs whenever appropriate. Homeowners received clearer explanations whenever questions arose. The management company created an online reporting system that automatically recorded dates, supporting documents, and communication history so that every concern followed the same consistent process. As an engineer, I appreciated systems designed to reduce human error, and that was exactly what these improvements accomplished. They made fairness part of the procedure rather than depending entirely on individual judgment. One Saturday morning, several neighbors gathered near the clubhouse for a volunteer landscaping event. Before all of this, I probably would have finished my work and quietly gone home. Instead, people stopped to introduce themselves, ask about engineering projects, or simply thank me for remaining patient throughout the entire situation. One retired firefighter told me he respected the fact that I had solved the problem without creating unnecessary conflict. Another neighbor admitted she had previously been hesitant to question HOA decisions because she assumed nothing would ever change. Now she felt more comfortable raising concerns respectfully because she had seen that evidence and professionalism could actually make a difference. Even Linda seemed different. She still participated in board meetings and community projects, but the confidence that had once appeared unshakable had gradually been replaced by something healthier. She listened more than she spoke, asked questions before making conclusions, and frequently reminded board members to verify information before sending notices to homeowners. One afternoon, we happened to arrive at the neighborhood mailbox at the same time. We exchanged a friendly greeting, talked briefly about an upcoming community picnic, and then went our separate ways. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Yet it reflected how much had changed since those early Tuesday mornings when suspicion quietly filled the air. Respect had replaced tension because accountability had replaced assumptions. Months later, I cleaned out the garage and found the original notebook where I had recorded every weather report, every timestamp, and every observation. The pages looked almost excessive now, filled with careful handwriting documenting something as ordinary as a trash can. I smiled as I flipped through them because they reminded me that important lessons often begin with remarkably small events. I placed the notebook inside a storage box rather than throwing it away. Not because I expected to need it again, but because it represented a simple principle I hoped I would never forget. Patience is rarely exciting while you are practicing it, and careful preparation often goes unnoticed until the very end. Yet those quiet habits can accomplish more than anger ever will. Every Tuesday morning, my trash can remain exactly where I left it, and eventually I stopped checking the street with curiosity because there was nothing left to investigate. The problem had disappeared, but the lesson remained, standing as steadily as that ordinary green container beside the curb. By the time winter gave way to spring, the story had quietly faded from neighborhood conversation, but its impact could still be seen in small moments that most people probably never noticed. The monthly board meetings had become noticeably calmer because discussions were now centered on documented facts instead of assumptions. Homeowners who once hesitated to speak during public comment periods now asked thoughtful questions, knowing they would receive respectful answers supported by records rather than opinions. Even routine maintenance requests moved through the system more efficiently because every submission followed the same transparent process. As someone who spent his career improving systems, I appreciated watching an entire community become more organized simply because one uncomfortable experience had exposed weaknesses that nobody had wanted to acknowledge before. Around that time, the association invited volunteers to help review several outdated community guidelines before their annual policy update. I accepted the invitation, not because I wanted a position of authority, but because I believed practical experience often produced better solutions than abstract debates. During those meetings, I suggested several simple improvements, including clearer documentation standards, standardized inspection checklists, and written explanations whenever homeowners received notices requiring corrective action. None of the proposals were complicated, yet together they created consistency where uncertainty had once existed. To my surprise, nearly every recommendation received unanimous support from both the board and the residents attending the workshops. One evening after a meeting, the association manager stopped me in the parking lot and admitted that the procedures developed after my complaint had already reduced misunderstandings between homeowners and the board. He said complaints were being resolved faster because everyone now focused on evidence first instead of personal assumptions. Hearing that meant far more to me than the reimbursement check I had received months earlier. Financial compensation replaced a damaged trash can, but improved trust strengthened an entire neighborhood. Linda also continued changing in ways that felt genuine rather than performative. She no longer drove slowly through the subdivision searching for the smallest imperfections. Instead, she often walked the neighborhood, greeting homeowners by name and asking whether anyone needed assistance before discussing community rules. I noticed that people responded differently as well. Conversations that once ended with frustration now usually concluded with cooperation because both sides approached problems with mutual respect. It reminded me that leadership is rarely measured by how many rules someone enforces. More often, it is measured by whether people believe those rules are applied fairly. One Saturday morning, I rolled my trash can toward the curb while my next-door neighbor smiled and jokingly asked whether it was still the most famous trash can in Colorado. I laughed and replied that it had finally earned a quiet retirement. We both knew he was not really talking about the container itself. He was talking about everything it had unexpectedly changed. Looking down the street, I noticed dozens of trash cans lined neatly along the curbs, each one standing exactly where its owner had placed it. They looked completely ordinary, and that ordinary sight somehow felt extraordinary because it represented stability instead of uncertainty. I realized then that justice does not always arrive through dramatic victories or loud celebrations. Sometimes it appears quietly through better procedures, renewed trust, and neighbors who begin treating one another with a little more patience than they did before. Every Tuesday morning still began with a cup of coffee on my front porch, but instead of wondering what I might discover outside, I simply enjoyed watching another peaceful sunrise over a neighborhood that had finally learned the value of fairness supported by facts. Nearly a year has passed since those quiet Tuesday mornings first taught me that even the smallest pattern deserves attention if it repeats often enough. If someone had told me back then that a simple trash can would eventually improve the way an entire homeowners association served its community, I probably would have laughed. Yet standing on my front porch today with another cup of coffee in my hand, I can honestly say that the outcome was never really about plastic wheels, collection schedules, or neighborhood inspections. It was about choosing patience over frustration and preparation over impulse. The original notebook now rests on a shelf in my home office beside engineering manuals and project binders from throughout my career. Every so often I notice it while searching for another document, and it reminds me that solving problems has always followed the same basic principle whether I was designing a bridge or navigating a disagreement with neighbors. You begin by observing carefully. You verify your assumptions. You collect reliable information. Then you allow facts to guide every decision that follows. Those habits protected me far better than anger ever could have. Our neighborhood feels different now, not because every disagreement has disappeared, but because people approach disagreements differently. Homeowners ask questions without immediately expecting conflict. Board members explain decisions with supporting documentation instead of brief conclusions. New residents receive welcome packets describing community standards and language that emphasizes cooperation rather than enforcement. Even the annual neighborhood picnic seems warmer than it once did because conversations focus more on families, careers, gardening, and weekend plans than on complaints or rumors. Last summer, I watched children riding bicycles along the same street where my trash can once lay on its side every Tuesday morning. Parents laughed together on their driveways while neighbors helped one another move patio furniture before an afternoon storm rolled through the mountains. Nothing about the scene looked extraordinary, yet I found myself appreciating it more than I probably would have before everything happened. Peace is often easiest to recognize after you have experienced unnecessary tension. Linda remained on the board for another term before deciding to step aside and encourage newer volunteers to serve the community. The evening she announced her decision, she spoke about the importance of listening before reaching conclusions and thanked homeowners for holding the board accountable to the same standards expected of everyone else. I respected that because genuine growth is measured less by past mistakes than by what someone chooses to learn from them. We shook hands afterward, exchanged a few friendly words, and left the meeting as neighbors rather than opponents. Looking back now, I realized that my greatest victory was never proving who had been responsible for tipping over a trash can. The real victory came from refusing to let frustration decide my response. Careful documentation accomplished what heated arguments never would have accomplished. Quiet persistence changed procedures that affected hundreds of people long after my own problem had been resolved. Every Tuesday morning, I still wheel my trash can to the curb without giving it much thought, and every Wednesday I roll it back beside the garage exactly where it belongs. That ordinary routine has become my favorite reminder that lasting justice is rarely loud. More often, it arrives through steady hands, clear evidence, patient determination, and the simple decision to let truth stand firmly on its own until everyone else is finally ready to see it.